yours?
I need to see some identification. Now.
I'm standing on my own front porch. Why would I need to show you identification?
We received a call about a possible break-in at this address.
A break-in? Let me guess. Someone saw a black woman and assumed I was committing a crime.
Maybe. Now show me your ID and we can...
The morning of August 6, 2023 began like any quiet Sunday in Meadowbrook Estates, a suburban residential neighborhood where people mowed their lawns, washed their cars, and enjoyed the weekend. But at 11:42 a.m., a police officer would commit a mistake so monumentally stupid it would destroy his career in less than 20 minutes. The woman he stopped at the entrance to her own home was not a criminal, not an intruder, and definitely not someone who should be treated with suspicion. She was the Honorable Judge Vanessa Morrison, a circuit court judge with 15 years on the bench, and the officer's body camera would capture every second of his humiliation. Judge Morrison had just returned from her morning walk, a routine she had maintained for years. She wore a light beige blazer over casual clothes, carried her keys in her hand, and was simply unlocking her own door when she noticed the patrol car slowing down in front of her house. Vanessa had bought that house 7 years earlier, paid her taxes religiously, knew all her neighbors by name, and had never had a single problem with local law enforcement. Until that day. The officer driving that patrol car was Derek Matthews, an officer with 6 years in the department. Derek had a history that included 2 previous complaints for racial profiling, both filed away without serious consequences. He had developed a habit of patrolling more affluent neighborhoods, looking for people he thought didn't belong there, and his definition of who belonged or not was clearly based on skin color rather than any actual evidence of crime. Derek saw Vanessa standing on her own porch, and something in his brain decided she looked suspicious. Maybe it was the fact she was a black woman in a predominantly white neighborhood. Maybe it was the fact he simply couldn't imagine she actually lived in that beautiful brick house. Whatever the reason, he parked his patrol car, activated his body camera, and walked toward her property with the confidence of someone who believed he was doing his job. Vanessa saw the officer approaching and immediately felt that familiar sinking feeling that many black people know too well. She was at her own home, on her own property, with her own keys in her hand, and yet she was about to be treated as if she had no right to be there. She took a deep breath, preparing herself for what she knew was about to happen, even after all these years as a judge, even after dedicating her entire life to the justice system. Derek approached the porch with body language that made it clear he was investigating something he considered suspicious. He didn't say good morning. He didn't introduce himself politely. He simply began asking questions that assumed Vanessa had no right to be exactly where she was, and the camera on his chest began recording evidence that would eventually cost him everything. Derek Matthews stopped in the middle of the walkway leading to Vanessa's porch and began his interrogation. He asked what she was doing there, as if being at one's own home required justification. Vanessa, who had presided over countless cases involving police misconduct, immediately recognized what was happening. She responded calmly that she was entering her house, gesturing to the door behind her and the keys in her hand. But Derek wasn't satisfied with that answer. The officer then asked if she lived there, his voice loaded with obvious skepticism. Vanessa confirmed yes, she had owned the house for 7 years. Derek looked at the house, at the surrounding neighborhood, and then back at Vanessa with an expression suggesting he simply didn't believe her. He asked to see some identification, saying he had received reports of suspicious activity in the area. Vanessa knew this was a lie. There were no reports. She was being racially profiled on her own property. The judge decided at that moment she wouldn't make things easy for Derek. She had every right to be at her own home without being interrogated, and she knew the law better than probably anyone Derek had ever stopped. Vanessa asked what was the probable cause for the stop, what specific crime he suspected she had committed. Derek hesitated, his body language shifting slightly. He wasn't used to people knowing their rights or questioning his authority. Derek tried to change tactics, saying he was just checking the neighborhood, making sure everything was safe. But his hand remained near his utility belt, his posture remained defensive, and his tone continued suggesting Vanessa was an intruder rather than a resident. He repeated his request for identification, this time with more insistence, saying it would be easier if she just cooperated. That word, cooperated, as if knowing and exercising her constitutional rights was somehow uncooperative. Neighbors began noticing the situation. The elderly lady across the street, Margaret Chen, who had been invited to dinners at Vanessa's house several times, came out to her own porch to observe. Two teenagers washing a car further down the street stopped what they were doing. A man walking his dog slowed his pace, clearly intrigued by what was happening. The scene was attracting attention, and Derek was too focused on Vanessa to notice how many witnesses were gathering. Vanessa finally decided to end the charade. She asked Derek if he knew who she was, not in an arrogant or threatening way, but simply stating a fact that was about to change the entire dynamic of the situation. Derek responded that he didn't care who she thought she was, that he was a police officer, and she needed to show identification immediately. This would be the last moment Derek Matthews would feel in control of the situation, because what Vanessa was about to reveal would transform his routine racial profiling into a career nightmare. Vanessa Morrison maintained her composure, the same composure she maintained in her courtroom every day when dealing with difficult cases and argumentative lawyers. She calmly informed Derek that she was Judge Vanessa Morrison of the County Circuit Court and that he was making a massive mistake by harassing her on her own property without probable cause or legal justification. She didn't raise her voice, didn't use her title in a threatening way, simply stated the facts of the situation clearly and unequivocally. Derek froze for a moment, processing what she had just said, but his ego and his prejudices still pushed him forward instead of backing down. The officer tried to save the situation by changing his tone slightly, but the damage was already done. He said he was just doing his job, just checking the neighborhood, and that if she really was a judge, then she shouldn't have a problem showing identification to prove it. But the body camera captured the moment of hesitation on his face, that flash of realization that he might have made a serious mistake. Vanessa responded that she had no legal obligation to provide identification when she was standing on her own property, committing no crime, and not operating a vehicle. She knew the law because she interpreted the law every day, and Derek was violating her Fourth Amendment constitutional rights against illegal searches and seizures. Margaret Chen, the elderly neighbor from across the street, could no longer stay quiet. She walked across the street and approached Vanessa's property, calling out to Derek and telling him that, yes, this was Judge Morrison, and yes, she had lived there for years, and that he should stop harassing her immediately. Margaret was visibly upset, her voice trembling with indignation at seeing her friend and neighbor being treated this way. Other neighbors also began speaking up, confirming Vanessa's identity and expressing disbelief that a police officer was questioning a respected community member at her own home simply because she was black. Derek was now surrounded not just by Vanessa, but by multiple witnesses who were all confirming her story and questioning his actions. He should have apologized and left at that moment, acknowledging he had made an error in judgment, but instead, he doubled down, insisting he had the right to verify the identity of anyone he considered suspicious, regardless of where they were or what they were doing. This statement was captured perfectly by the body camera and would later be used as prima facie evidence that Derek didn't understand the basic constitutional rights he had sworn to protect. Vanessa then did something that demonstrated both her authority and her exhausted patience. She took out her cell phone and called directly to the police chief, someone she knew professionally through years of work in the criminal justice system. The conversation was brief and professional, Vanessa calmly explaining that one of his officers was harassing her at her own home without probable cause, and that the situation needed to be resolved immediately. She mentioned Derek's name and badge number, which was clearly visible on his uniform, and then held the phone so the police chief could hear what was happening in real time. Derek finally began to realize the gravity of what he had done. His face changed from defensive to concerned when he realized Vanessa wasn't bluffing, that she really was who she said she was, and that his boss was now directly aware of the situation. The body camera captured the exact moment when reality sank in, when Derek understood that his insistence on racially profiling a black woman on her own property had just blown up in his face in the worst possible way. He had stopped and interrogated a circuit court judge, someone with significant authority in the justice system, someone who knew every detail of constitutional law, and someone who now had high-definition video evidence of the entire interaction captured by Derek's own camera. Police Chief David Harrison personally arrived at Vanessa's house in less than 15 minutes. This was unprecedented. The chief rarely responded personally to calls. But when a circuit court judge calls reporting police harassment, the situation demands immediate attention at the highest level. Harrison exited his unmarked vehicle with an expression mixing professional concern and barely contained anger. He greeted Vanessa with respect, apologized profusely for the situation, and then turned his attention to Derek with a look that made the officer appear to want to disappear into the pavement. Derek's body camera continued recording everything, capturing his own humiliation and the consequences of his prejudiced actions. Harrison asked Derek to explain exactly why he had stopped and interrogated Judge Morrison on her own property. Derek tried to articulate some justification about suspicious activity and routine neighborhood checks, but his words sounded empty and pathetic in the face of obvious facts. There were no crime reports in the area. There was no suspicious activity. There was absolutely no legal reason for Derek to have stopped Vanessa beyond his own assumptions based on her skin color. Harrison listened to Derek's weak explanation and then asked to see the body camera footage immediately, right there on the street, wanting to understand the full scope of his officer's mistake. The recording was played on a tablet Harrison carried in his vehicle, used specifically to review body camera footage during field investigations. Vanessa, Harrison, Derek, and several neighbors who were still gathered watched as the video showed the entire interaction from the beginning. The footage was damning beyond any reasonable doubt. It showed Derek approaching Vanessa without any probable cause, asking accusatory questions based purely on assumptions, ignoring her reasonable explanations, and persisting even after multiple witnesses confirmed her identity and residence. The video also captured Derek's problematic statements about having the right to check anyone he deemed suspicious, revealing a fundamentally flawed understanding of constitutional rights. Harrison turned off the tablet and instructed Derek to return immediately to the department, not to complete his shift, but to turn in his equipment and be placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. Derek tried to protest, saying he was just doing his job, that he didn't know she was a judge, as if Vanessa's profession was the problem, instead of his actions being constitutionally illegal against any citizen, regardless of their title or position. Harrison cut off Derek's excuses abruptly, telling him the conversation ended there and that he should leave immediately before the situation got even worse for everyone involved. After Derek left, Harrison spent another 20 minutes talking with Vanessa and the neighbors who witnessed the incident. He collected statements from Margaret, Chen, and 3 other residents who had seen the confrontation from the beginning. Each witness confirmed that Vanessa wasn't doing anything remotely suspicious, that she was simply entering her own home, and that Derek had initiated contact based apparently on nothing but her race. Harrison also noted this wasn't the first incident involving Derek and racial profiling. There were those 2 previous complaints the department had filed away, and now he realized those prior warnings had been ignored until the situation escalated to this embarrassing and potentially costly point. Vanessa made it clear to Harrison that she wasn't looking for an informal apology or an empty promise to do better. She wanted a full and transparent investigation. She wanted the body camera video preserved and made available to the public, and she wanted assurances that Derek would face real and meaningful consequences for his actions. As a judge who had presided over police misconduct cases, Vanessa understood all too well how these incidents were often swept under the rug when the department protected their own. She wouldn't allow that to happen this time. Harrison, to his credit, agreed to all of Vanessa's demands and promised complete transparency throughout the investigative process, knowing that failing to handle this properly could result in severe legal consequences and lasting reputational damage to the department. The internal investigation began the next day and quickly became one of the most thorough the department had ever conducted. Pressure was coming from multiple directions, Judge Morrison watching every move, local media that picked up the story almost immediately, civil rights organizations demanding transparency, and even other circuit court judges expressing concern about how one of their colleagues had been treated. The body camera video was made available to the public within a week, and the reaction was explosive. People watched in disbelief as Derek questioned Vanessa on her own property, ignored her reasonable explanations, disregarded her clearly visible FBI credentials, and persisted even when neighbors confirmed she lived there. The video had over 2 million views on social media platforms within 72 hours, with comments overwhelmingly criticizing Derek and the department for allowing this type of behavior to continue unchecked. Investigators interviewed 17 witnesses during the course of their investigation, including all the neighbors who had witnessed the incident, other officers who had worked with Derek, and several citizens who had filed those 2 previous racial profiling complaints the department had filed away. What emerged was a disturbing pattern of behavior extending over years. Derek apparently routinely targeted black people in predominantly white neighborhoods, making pretextual traffic stops, unnecessary ID checks, and generally treating African American citizens with suspicion he never applied to white residents. One woman testified that Derek had stopped her 3 times in 6 months while she visited her elderly mother in an expensive neighborhood, each time demanding to know what she was doing there, as if she needed permission to visit her own family. The 2 previous complaints that had been filed away became central evidence that the department had failed in its responsibility to address misconduct. One complaint from 2 years earlier involved Derek stopping a black college professor who was jogging in his own neighborhood, accusing him of trying to run away from something when he was literally just exercising. The second complaint from a year earlier involved a black family being stopped and interrogated while unloading a moving van at the house they had just purchased, with Derek insisting he needed to verify they actually had permission to be there. In both cases, the department had conducted superficial investigations, accepted Derek's explanations without much scrutiny, and filed the cases away as misunderstandings or standard procedures. Now, in light of the incident with Judge Morrison, these previous cases revealed a systematic pattern of racial profiling the department had negligently ignored. The police union initially tried to defend Derek, issuing statements about officers doing difficult work in challenging situations and deserving the benefit of the doubt. But when the video became public and the story gained national traction, even the union began backing away from their support. The union president gave an interview acknowledging the video looked problematic and that perhaps Derek needed additional retraining, a position that enraged racial justice activists who pointed out that retraining wasn't appropriate for someone who had repeatedly demonstrated inability to perform their duties without prejudice. The pressure on the department and union intensified when a group of 72 practicing black attorneys in the county sent an open letter demanding Derek's firing and systemic reforms on how the department handled racial profiling complaints. The final investigation report was released 6 weeks after the incident, and its findings were unequivocal and devastating. Investigators determined Derek had violated multiple departmental policies, including proper procedures for investigative stops, respectful treatment of citizens, and fundamental constitutional duties related to the Fourth Amendment. The report specifically noted that Derek had no probable cause or reasonable suspicion to stop Judge Morrison, that his actions demonstrated clear racial bias, and that his behavior during the incident showed a troubling lack of understanding about basic civil rights. The report also severely criticized the department's previous failures to adequately address prior complaints against Derek, noting that if these complaints had been taken seriously and properly investigated, the incident with Judge Morrison could have been prevented entirely. The final recommendation was immediate termination of employment, permanent revocation of police certification, and referral of the case to the district attorney for possible criminal prosecution for deprivation of rights under federal civil rights law. Chief Harrison accepted all recommendations without hesitation, knowing anything less would be inadequate given the severity of the misconduct and the damage to public trust. Derek Matthews was officially fired from the police department 8 weeks after stopping Judge Morrison at her own home. His 6-year career ended not by a single moment of bad judgment, but by an established pattern of racism that finally encountered someone with the knowledge, resources, and determination to hold him accountable for his actions. Judge Vanessa Morrison returned to her work at the circuit court, but the incident had changed her in ways she didn't expect. She had always known intellectually that racial profiling existed, had presided over cases about it, had read countless victim accounts, but experiencing it personally at her own home brought a visceral understanding that no amount of academic study could replicate. In later interviews, Vanessa spoke openly about how humiliating and infuriating it was to be treated like a criminal on her own property, how the incident forced her to confront the reality that neither her title nor her education nor her decades of public service protected her from being seen first as a suspicious black woman before anything else. She used her platform to advocate for stronger police reforms, better accountability mechanisms, and more rigorous training on implicit bias, becoming an influential voice in conversations about racial justice in the legal system. Derek Matthews disappeared from public life after his firing, but his legacy remained as a cautionary tale recorded in high-definition video. The body camera footage became one of the most widely used recordings in police training across the country, shown at police academies, refresher seminars, and bias training sessions. Instructors paused at key moments to analyze each bad decision Derek made: the initial approach without probable cause, the refusal to accept reasonable explanations, the persistence in the face of multiple witnesses, and the final attempt to assert authority he legally didn't have. The video became a perfect example of how not to conduct oneself as a law enforcement officer, and Derek's name became synonymous with racial profiling in police training circles. He tried to find work in private security, but the viral video followed him everywhere, and few employers were willing to hire someone whose face was recognizable as the cop who tried to arrest a judge at her own home. The police department faced significant consequences beyond Derek's firing. The district attorney opened a broader investigation into patterns of racial profiling within the department, examining data on traffic stops, ID checks, and arrests to determine if there were statistical disparities along racial lines. The data was damning, showing black motorists were 3 times more likely to be stopped than white motorists in predominantly white neighborhoods, even when controlling for factors like traffic violations. The investigation led to a consent decree with the Federal Justice Department requiring outside oversight, policy reforms, and implementation of early warning systems to identify officers with problematic patterns of behavior before those issues escalated to serious incidents. The financial cost of these reforms was estimated at over $3 million in the first 2 years, not to mention the intangible damage to the department's reputation and community relations. Margaret Chen and the other neighbors who witnessed the incident became vocal advocates in the community, speaking at city council meetings about the importance of citizens intervening when they witness injustice. Margaret gave several interviews about her decision to cross the street and confront Derek, explaining she couldn't stand by while her friend and neighbor was being harassed. She encouraged other residents, particularly white residents in predominantly white neighborhoods, to be alert for racial profiling and to speak up when they saw it happening. Her activism helped shift the culture in the neighborhood, creating an environment where people felt empowered to question authority when that authority was being exercised unjustly. Vanessa's home, which had been the site of her humiliation, became a symbol of resistance and accountability in the community. The case inspired several legislative changes at the state level. Legislators introduced and passed the Judge Morrison Police Accountability Act, named in her honor, which required all police departments in the state to implement robust systems for tracking and investigating racial profiling complaints. The law mandated that complaints could no longer be filed away without proper investigation, that patterns of problematic behavior would trigger mandatory reviews, and that officers found engaging in racial profiling would face consequences, including possible certification revocation. The law also required collection and publication of data on police stops disaggregated by race, allowing researchers and advocates to identify departments with discriminatory practices. Vanessa attended the law's signing ceremony, giving a powerful speech about how a traumatic personal experience could be transformed into systemic change that would protect countless others from facing what she had faced. The lasting legacy of the incident extended far beyond one firing or policy changes. It became a cultural reference point, a moment that captured on clear video what many black people had experienced, but rarely could prove so unequivocally. The video left no room for plausible deniability or alternative interpretations. It showed exactly what racial profiling looked like in action, captured by the very camera of the officer perpetrating it. For Black communities, it offered validation that their experiences were real and documentable. For law enforcement, it offered a clear example of why body cameras mattered and why accountability couldn't be optional. And for Judge Morrison, it transformed a moment of personal indignity into a catalyst for change that would eventually touch lives far beyond that Sunday morning on her porch. The body camera Derek believed would protect him became the instrument of his downfall, proving that sometimes justice happens when technology captures truth so clearly that even the most cynical cannot deny it. Vanessa Morrison remained on the bench, continued serving justice with distinction, and carried with her the satisfaction of knowing that standing up to Derek that day not only protected her own dignity, but created ripples of accountability that would change how racial profiling was treated throughout the entire state.